All right. Hi, everyone. For those of you who have already attended, you are familiar with this introduction, but for those who are just joining us for the first time, welcome. Thank you for joining Diventures today for our third episode of our Oceans Update webinar series. Today, we'll be talking about lionfish, which is a really great topic. And Alex and I are super excited for this topic. So thank you for joining us. My name is Sabrina Severin, and I am the Ocean Health Education and Conservation Coordinator here at Diventures, and I've been here a little over a year. I also have my master's degree in marine conservation from the University of Miami, so love these kinds of webinars. Dr. Alex Brylske is the founder of Ocean Education International, a consulting firm focusing on environmental education and professional development for the marine tourism industry, specializing in the recreational scuba sector. He's also currently the Director of Education at Reef Smart and is also the author of The Complete Diver and Beneath the Blue Planet, which can both be purchased at your local Diventures. Dr. Brylske holds a Master of Arts in Instructional Systems Design, a Master of Science in Marine Biology and Coastal Zone Management, and an EDS and PhD in Science Education with a technical specialty in oceanography. He has a unique and diverse background that combines education and marine conservation, and we are honored to share this knowledge and passion with you today. I hope you enjoy this webinar. Please remain muted throughout the webinar. If you have questions at the end, feel free to unmute yourself to ask those questions, or you can put them in the chat and I can relay the question out loud for Dr. Brylske. So thank you. Dr. Brylske, take it away.
Thank you, Sabrina. Welcome back for those of you who have been with us for the past two sessions. If you have not, a quick orientation. What we've been doing is dividing our session into three segments. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call in the news. Specifically, it's some important conservation news and some things that aren't necessarily good news. The bulk, as Sabrina indicated, is going to be a discussion of lionfish, which I've fortunately been able to update through contacts I've had with some experts. And then lastly, our travel log this month, we're going to look at the magical island of Dominica. So without further ado, let's get into the news issues. You may have heard that there was an important breakthrough with the United Nations group called the Conference on Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction. And that's just a fancy way of talking about the high seas. So let me talk a little bit about what that means to begin with. Generally, from an international legal perspective, there are what are termed territorial seas and high seas. Territorial seas are those regions of the coast that are claimed as essentially possessions of a particular nation. Historically, these have extended 3 miles offshore because, frankly, in the 17th, 18th century, that's about as far as a cannon would reach. And that was expanded a little bit more after in the 20th century to about 12 miles. And then more recently, in the past 40 or so years, particularly after the Second World War, there were concerns with countries coming into near shore, but still beyond territorial waters to fish and exploit resources. And there were several minor wars over that, one between Iceland and England. And countries began to impose what they call a 200-mile limit or exclusive economic zone, meaning they don't necessarily declare ownership, but they do control the exploitation of any economic resource, fisheries, mining, etc. And so we've had this 200-mile limit agreed upon through the UN High Seas Treaty, or the treaty with the Knowles. But the issue has been what's going on in the areas beyond national control in this vast area of the ocean. It's pretty much been open territory. There's a lot of exploitation that really is uncontrollable. There's a lot of illegal fishing. And for some time, there's been an attempt through the UN to bring some order to that. And the agreement recently, the High Seas Treaty, which was passed by the UN, uh, did will not in and of itself do anything yet because each signatory nation has to ratify the treaty, and that will take the approval of our Senate and other nations as well. But it's an important first step, particularly an important first step on what's been described as the 30-30 initiative, and this is to declare 30% of the ocean a reserve, a no-take protected reserve by 2030. And this will at least begin to put the structure to enable that to happen. So this is an important step. I'm particularly proud because the young lady you see on the left there is a former colleague who's now involved in the UN environmental program. So stay tuned. On a different topic, you may have been seeing in the news what is regarded as the largest uh, harmful algal bloom on the planet. This is the massive belt of sargassum, which is a floating seaweed, essentially a brown algae that that is extended now 5,000 miles across the North Atlantic from Africa up into the Caribbean. And you can kind of see from the slide there, it's an enormous quantity, 24.2 million tons. This is a relatively new phenomenon. There has been the Sargasso Sea, a stationary, relatively stationary region northeast of the Bahamas, but this is something altogether different. And I'll show you in a minute what the extent is. The problem with this is multifaceted, but importantly, the question is what has caused it. And there's been quite a bit of research done on this by a colleague of mine, actually. And what the assumption is, and strong evidence to support, it's another example of eutrophication, high nutrients, and specifically nutrients that have been put into the North Atlantic from the major river sources, the Amazon, the Orinoco, the Congo, the Mississippi. All of that extra nutrient combined with the warming seas and possibly even contributions from Sahara dust from the atmosphere has just bred this soup, so to speak, and allowed sargassum to just go absolutely bananas. Here's a compilation of the status from 2011. In the little blue area in the upper left, you kind of don't see a whole lot. It wasn't terribly extensive at that point. And over the course of the years, and of course in 2018, it started to become the problem that it is today. And so you can see it's, as I said, the largest harmful algal bloom on the face of the planet. So the most important issue probably relating to this is the impact it's having on tourism. You can imagine showing up to a beach that you can't even access because the sargassum is just piled 4 or 5 feet high. That's happened to me in past years in the Florida Keys at Sandspur Beach in Bahia Honda. And it's become quite problematic throughout the entire Caribbean and Florida. And as you can see, I think from the past, most recently, the government of Barbados removed 1,600 dump load trucks of sargassum from its own from their beaches. One of the issues that's important is, in order to, what can you do with this material, if anything? And it has been utilized for fertilizer. One of the problems with the fertilizer use is it tends to be high in arsenic and cadmium, and it's advised really not to be used for fertilizing food unless it is sufficiently processed. The other very innovative, almost science fiction-y approach that's being strongly considered is dumping it into the deep ocean. You kind of see on the left-hand side that graphic where they're working on technology to essentially collect it in these autonomous dump trucks essentially, and then place it well below in the deep ocean, where that carbon would be sequestered for centuries, even millennia. So it could be, one way we could recapture some of the carbon and keep it in the biosphere as opposed to the atmosphere. So stay tuned from a tourism perspective. You're likely, if you're traveling to Florida or the Caribbean, encounter some of these issues. And as you can see, it's kind of nasty stuff. The problem, of course, aside from it being unpleasant and making a beach unusable, is as it rots, it decomposes and gives off hydrogen sulfide gas, and in the process of decomposition, extinguishes much of the oxygen in the water. And from a public health perspective, it can be quite significant. These are just two recent examples from Virgin Islands, and here in this recent article as well. From a human health standpoint, there was a paper done based on a research project in Martinique that actually showed some correlation between the increased hydrogen sulfide and increased incidence of preeclampsia in pregnant women. So this is a serious health concern aside from being an aesthetic nuisance. Lastly, I just wanted to mention, if you haven't already seen, there is a project called Neptune 100 ongoing currently in Key Largo at the Jules Undersea Lodge, which is the undersea hotel, which was formerly a habitat in Puerto Rico back in the 1980s. Dr. Joe Dituri, who is actually a former naval officer and currently a professor of bioengineering at University of South Florida, is spending 100 days in the habitat. Now, the current record, by the way, is 72 days. But the reason for this is not simply to break records. There's a substantial amount of scientific research and an entire team supporting Dr. Dituri. And he's doing everything from blood analysis to exercise physiology. He's got a team of 12 of psychologists, physicians, physiologists, and really looking at the whole phenomenon of humans being isolated at depth for that length of time. Importantly, they've expanded beyond simply the scientific value, and they're using this as an opportunity to increase awareness of marine conservation and STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, particularly with girls. And in fact, one of the first groups that he had down there with him was a group from the Dive Into Life group in the Florida Keys, where they spent some time, down there with Dr. Dituri. And so over the course of the 100 days, there'll be a number of individuals and groups that will be spending time, and they'll be broadcasting. There's a YouTube channel, which you can link from the website here. And I will be actually joining him on April 2nd, this Sunday. I'm going to spend 24 hours with Dr. Dituri. We're going to be talking about STEM education and the role tourism plays in marine conservation. So log on to the, I don't think it's going to be a live broadcast. I think they're going to record and then upload to the YouTube channel sometime early next week. So stay tuned. Anyway, so much for in the news. Let's talk about lionfish. Lionfish, of course, are beautiful. I remember seeing my first one in Thailand 30 years ago. They're just very spectacular critters. I'm on the board of trustees of the Reef Environmental Education Foundation, and we do a significant amount of research. In fact, we have a full-time PhD scientist and an associate that are tasked to simply dealing with lionfish-related issues. So I'm fortunate enough to be kind of in the cutting edge of what's going on in the field. And I wanted to kind of give you some perspective, because this is an area that's of great interest, but there's also a lot of misinformation about this unfortunate critter. But I want to start by explaining something, and that's the terms exotic versus invasive. There have been a lot of exotic species that have been documented in Florida and the Caribbean, more than 30. In fact, Reef maintains an entire portion of its website where you can report sightings of the fishes you see here and actually many more. An exotic species is merely one that doesn't belong where it is. It did not evolve to be in that specific area. It becomes invasive when the exotic starts to have some impact on the environment, some detrimental impact on the environment. And in the case of these 30-odd species, none of which have had any impact on the environment because these are one or two individuals that, for whatever reason, cannot survive. They can't reproduce. They're probably eaten. There was one very famous instance where a couple of batfish off Key Largo were actually taken by researchers from the New England Aquarium who took them back to Boston, put them on display, and they were never seen on the reef again. But the singular exception to that, of course, is the lionfish, and that in fact has become a serious invasive critter, which does require action, as we'll see. In fact, if you do see a fish that looks like it shouldn't be there, there is on the website for Reef, you can actually upload an image and confirm that it is in fact not a non-native species. First of all, there are actually two different species that have invaded the tropical Western Atlantic, and that is the red lionfish, Pteroris volitans. You see its range on the lower left there. It's pretty extensive throughout the Indo-Pacific there. And then what's commonly referred to as the devilfish, Pteroris miles. And you see its range a little further west in the Indian Ocean, etc. Now, there are actually 10 other species in the genus Pteroris, and this contains all of what are called the lion and zebrafishes. WIP, by the way, is Western Indo-Pacific. So these two are essentially two of that particular genus. And of course, well, this is the native range. You kind of see volitans is kind of geared more eastward, miles a little more westward, and then they kind of commingle in what's known as the Coral Triangle there in Indonesia and Malaysia, etc. You'll note as well the green areas. These are the invaded areas, which include the Western Atlantic, far more so than is indicated there, by the way, and more recently in the Mediterranean. Take a look at the top. You'll see this is a GIF showing you a sequence of time, and you see around 1985 there was a sighting, and then in the early 90s, a little bit few more sightings, and then by 2000, you kind of see things explode. And so that stopped at 2014, and you can imagine things have just continued since. So, for all intents and purposes, these fishes have established themselves throughout the Western Atlantic. But if you paid attention, you might have noted, here it comes, you see the dots off New York and Rhode Island, and you wonder how can a tropical fish survive there? Well, there's a phenomenon that occurs in all major ocean currents, but in the Gulf of the Gulf Stream in particular, where during summer, or actually all year, as that meandering Gulf Stream heads to the northeast, you can see on the right-hand side, it wobbles back and forth. And under the right conditions, if these wobbles can pinch off and the warm water from the right side, which is influenced by the Gulf Stream, can pinch off to the colder water on the left side, which is basically coming down from the Labrador Current, those gyres can develop, and in fact, you see one for real in this space image. All of that warm water, including all of the contents within that warm water, just meander around, and they will, come close to shore. I began diving in the Northeast off the New Jersey coast, and periodically we would see during the summertime tropical fish. Now, as we'll see, lionfish will not survive the winter, but they are sighted with some regularity as far north as Rhode Island. Kind of interesting little tidbit. This is just kind of showing you the date at which they were sighted in the various locations. And you'll see on the right-hand side, they have invaded the eastern Mediterranean through the Suez Canal, of course, and they seem to have gotten to Sicily and off the coast of Libya there. And so the problem persists as well in the Mediterranean. Now, one of the things that has made them so capable in this regard is the drifting stage of their larva is pretty significant. It can last, as you see, from 24 to 27 days. And if you take that into account with the major currents that flush throughout the Caribbean, you can kind of understand how things have happened. What's kind of interesting is they were not seen in the Florida Keys until 2009. And so what that tells you is it took that long for them to, because the Gulf Stream, of course, is moving northeasterly, but eventually getting entrained into the Caribbean current, they had to be brought back through the Yucatan Channel and up into the Gulf of Mexico. So it kind of shows the relationship between ocean currents and biological phenomena. Here is a potential range. It was thought for a while that they probably wouldn't get too far, or they wouldn't get into Brazil because of the barrier of the Amazon. And no, they are now in Brazil, not to the extent that they are in the Caribbean. But this is the full potential range of the species. So why are they problematic? They're fast growing. They are just gluttonous eaters. They eat virtually everything, and we'll talk a little bit about what has been found in the gut analysis, both fishes and crustaceans. They can consume prey faster than it can be reproduced, and in fact, we'll talk a bit about that in a minute here. They can consume prey almost half their body size. And of course, part of what they're eating are commercially important species such as snappers, snapper, grouper, lobster, etc. With a little bit of hesitancy, I would say they have no natural predators, although there's some. I'm going to show you a video that kind of gives us hope in that regard. And they don't have really that many predators in their home range, and that begs the question: how are they controlled in their home range? Well, you can control a species by means other than predation on the adults or the juveniles. And that, of course, is by controlling their larvae. In other words, eating the fish while they're still in larval form. And so there could be organisms that are quite effective at predating the eggs. But bottom line, of course, they've evolved over hundreds of millions of years in the Pacific. So things have kind of stabilized in that regard. The center of density and abundance of these critters seems for some reason to be the central Bahamas, where at times they can get densities of 200 plus. I even heard one study of more than 500 per acre, to the point where they have documented studies where the fish have eliminated 80% of the juvenile species over the course of a few months. So ecologically, these critters can have very significant impact on the ecology of coral reefs in the Western Atlantic. As I said, they can consume prey of their half their own size. And by the way, I would ask that, given that Sabrina has done research in this realm, if you have anything to add, please feel free to chime in here. And so these are just the rogues gallery of critters from gut content analysis. Here's an example of a gut content from one fish. Their stomachs can expand 30 times their normal size, and they essentially will eat basically till once they explode. And the problem, of course, is they did not evolve here, and therefore the prey fish have had no evolutionary experience in recognizing or escaping from it. And you can kind of see from this little image, this wafting, set of feathers, just as, is really something that no Atlantic fish has had to deal with ever in its evolutionary history. And so they simply come along and slurp things up in a very prodigious manner. So you say there's no recognition whatsoever that this is a predator. So easy pickings, to say the least. Now, their reproductive capacity, or what we call in science their fecundity, is utterly amazing. First, they mature very quickly. They're broadcast spawners like most reef fishes, but they're a bit unusual in, rather than simply dispersing the eggs and sperm, they will produce this kind of a gelatinous mass, egg balls. As you kind of see there, the upper image is a photograph, and there's a microscopy image of the gametes within it. It's also believed, though not yet confirmed, that there could be some kind of noxious or toxic substance extruded with the egg mass, which deters predation, but that's only speculation. So they can spawn 30,000 eggs every 4 days under good conditions. If the water is warm, the conditions are right. And so there's really no mystery why they become so prolific, because they're real good at making more lionfish. The other problem is that the habitat of lionfish is really simple to explain. It's everywhere. They've been found along bridge pilings and piers and mangroves. They've been found, of course, on shallow coral reefs. They've been found on deep wrecks, and they've been retrieved by fishers in lobster pots from hundreds of feet. And essentially, the only thing that limits them is temperature. They are limited by temperature, and it seems as though about 50 degrees C, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 C is their lethal limit. And just as you thought they couldn't be everywhere, here's an image from a submarine off Bermuda in almost 1,000 feet of water, and there's your friendly little lionfish. And that becomes one of the issues in their management, as we'll see, because perhaps no matter how well we get at culling them in shallow depths where divers can reach, there's likely to be a continuing supply in water far deeper than divers can reach. And we'll get to that point in a bit. The issue in the culling has given that culling has been going on now for 20 years, we've learned a lot from it in terms of what to do and what not to do. And it was quite common in the early days, especially, that rather than deal with all the spines and all the potential issues, that cullers would simply feed them to anything willing to eat them, which essentially were moray eels, large grouper, and sharks. And there have been some unintended consequences. I'm going to show you a sequence here from a dive in the Cayman Islands. So this is just a group of tourists leisurely having a good old time. And here comes Mr. Green Moray. Unusual to see a moray out and active, of course, in the daytime. So surprise, surprise. So quite insistent. By the way, the other thing that's kind of interesting, a side note, on the moray eels have two sets of jaws. They have the jaws that you see, and they have pharyngeal jaws deep in the throat. If you've ever seen the alien monster in the Sigourney Weaver movies, so they're quite effective. But anyway, uh, there have been many examples of moray eels, and as you'll see in a second, even sharks that have become habituated by being fed these lionfish, and therefore it's strongly suggested not to do that. So there have been several culling efforts that had to have been curtailed because shark populations in the few islands of the Caribbean where they have a sufficient density, they become so accustomed that it really is hazardous to cull the fish. So bottom line, we no longer feed the lionfish to the local residents. And of course, the other problem with handling them is they happen to be venomous. Not all of the spines, but as you see from the image on the right there are 13 dorsal, 2 pelvic, and 3 anal spines that are venomous. And unlike snakes that have the hypodermic like fangs, the spines on a lionfish are more akin to stingrays, in that the spine has a channel, and you'll see from the central photograph there, the skin will push back, and at the base where the person's thumb is, there is a venom gland, and that venom will travel along the ridge you see in the upper right, and then actually create the envenomation. So, the first aid response, as with many envenomations, would be hot water. Uh, and by the way, I would encourage that the person that judges hot water not be the victim. I've been the victim of stingray stings, and I made the mistake of judging the hot water myself in pain and ended up scalding my foot in the process. Do not pee on them. That has nothing to do with this. Heat is denaturing the venom. But I would add that the little product you see in the lower left there, Stingmaster, was developed specifically for lionfish. And I had an opportunity to actually attend a lecture from the developers at DEMA a few years ago and have used this. I've not yet had an opportunity to use it on a lionfish sting, but many times now for jellyfish. And it is miraculous. It is really an effective product. And I get no recompense for that. So I would encourage you to take a look at that as a product of both Diventures, and if you're a diver, have it in your dive bag. There's been no reports of fatalities. However, if people are sensitive due to allergic reaction, you certainly could succumb to anaphylactic shock. So an EpiPen is probably a good investment if you do have allergic reactions, if you're going to be diving around lionfish. I would encourage you likewise to log on to Lionfish University. This is a company that is basically devoted to the eradication of these critters, and they have a lot of fantastic information, videos, and products. Can't say enough words about them. And Reef as well has been hosting lionfish derbies at locations throughout the Caribbean. This year, they're going to expand that to a season-long derby or sweepstakes, rather, where you can actually submit evidence of your catch, and at the end of the year, they'll provide over $2,000 worth of prizes in the process. If you log on, you can get more details on this summer sweepstakes. The real problem, as I said, the culling can operate well in the regions where divers can dive. But what about areas below that? And what you see in this image, that there's about 750,000 square kilometers of shallow meaning less than 30 meters, 100 feet. But there's almost an equal amount in that range beyond to 300 feet. So there's a large section that just is not diveable, and therefore this is where the culling efforts need to be kind of beefed up. And the way these are being approached is through the development of innovative traps that can be deployed at these greater depths. This is an example of one of the trap designs. As you can imagine, the lionfish like structure. And by placing a piece of this PVC lattice work into this circular trap, they can deploy, let it sit for a while, and then come back after several hours. And they've been, quite successful. You can kind of see this video here of one of these traps being deployed. These are very much experimental. They tend to work in areas where there's not a lot of reef structure. So in other words, they work in areas of, for example, along the Florida Panhandle, where there aren't any coral reefs, but there's a lot of sand. They're also quite large, and so to get a fisher to deploy this might be a challenge. But the concept, the idea does work in this very selective trap. However, they've kind of moved on beyond this due to some practicalities. And what you see here is the next generation of a modified lobster pot. Now, lionfish are taken commonly in lobster pots, and the problem is with fish traps, which are illegal in U.S. waters because they're non-selective. If a trap is to be approved legally, it's going to have to show that it's not catching things other than lionfish, and hence they're working on escapement and other techniques that allow fish that aren't lionfish to get out. And this is kind of where the status is right now. It's still very much experimental. Whether this will be deployed and actually used, who knows? But the point is that the fish are commercially viable, and we'll get into the seafood aspect in a second. And I thought I would conclude the deep water culling by showing you some real high-tech approaches in use of AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles, that were designed to find and hunt fish. This one operates with a spear. So you can see there's no depth limit. And then apparently the CEO or someone associated with Roomba is also a diver. This one is another robot, and it's placing the fish between two electrodes and electrocuting it. And stucking it back into the container there. So a lot of great minds are thinking. The practicality of these technologies is yet to be shown. I think the trap idea is probably going to have a much greater utility. And then there was this instance documented and paper written on the basis, and you're going to see a perfectly healthy lionfish predated by MRAU. Fish was not speared. So, who knows? Perhaps if they don't eat all the fish in the Western Atlantic, there will be it will be assimilated into the ecology, and things will figure out how to eat it. So there may be hope after all. As I said, culling has been and practices to control lionfish have been in place now for a couple of decades. And this is just a quick roundup of what has been successful and what has not been successful. So indeed, we will not, and science has resigned itself, we will not eradicate these species, but we may be able to control them, particularly in the depth ranges that are significant for tourism and other shallow water, uses, et cetera, through all the techniques we've discussed. However, we have learned, as I've told you, one of the things we do not want to do is try to train predators. If Mother Nature has that happens on its own, one thing, but we've seen bad consequences, as you've seen from the videos, in trying to do that. And secondly, bounty programs, which were tried in the early days of culling, really don't work. It creates kind of a, you know, a response, an overwhelming response, quickly dissipating the funds, and it just has not been a successful technique. The successful techniques, however, have been studied, articulated, and in the text you see here, which are available from the Reef website. So there's a great deal of knowledge about just how these critters can be controlled. Fortunately, they are delicious, and consumptive conservation is something to be considered. They have a fantastic taste. They're akin to snapper. They make wonderful ceviche, by the way. So if economically fishers can bring these to market, and they often will make $6 a pound or more for these, which is a good price at the dock, and the supply chain can be satisfied for restaurants, this could be very much a viable fishery. And one of the other uses, if you're not aware, is a whole industry is evolving, developing jewelry from lionfish skin and various body parts. Anyway, so much for lionfish. Stay tuned. Lastly, the travelogue segment, I just wanted to talk about Dominica. And first, I wanted to clarify a couple of things. Their tagline is the nature island of the Caribbean, and to their credit, it's more than hype. Well back into the late 1970s, they really made a commitment to make their island something special because it is so relatively untouched. I've been to almost every island in the Caribbean, and I can attest there's something special about Dominica. But I want to clarify, this is not the Dominican Republic. Okay. Dominica is one of the Antilles in the the Lesser Antilles, as it's called, situated between St. Lucia and Guadeloupe. And I think there's a trip currently ongoing down there, if I'm not mistaken, another scheduled for July. So you have an opportunity to kind of visit. A couple of things in terms of its history. It was settled by Arawaks, which was an indigenous tribe in the Caribbean. They were displaced by the Klingo, which the Europeans renamed the Carib in the 15th century. It was actually discovered by a Spanish explorer, but settled by the French. It was a French colony, essentially, up until the end of the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, where it was ceded to Britain and until it was gained its independence in 1978. They have a unique parrot there, the Imperial Amazon, which is a spectacular bird, part of their national flag. I talked a little bit last time about St. Lucia and just why it is what it is. This whole chain of islands, this island arc is referred to it, is a result of the Caribbean plate. You see there in the lower left. And the various plates of the Earth collide at times, one being dragged under the other, as you kind of see with the animation here. The enormous heat and the water dragged underneath the Earth provides the energy to raise these mountains and create all of these geothermal phenomena. And it also is responsible, as I said last month, for the creation of the deepest part of the entire Atlantic Ocean, the Milwaukee Deep off of north of Puerto Rico. And so this is a very mountainous island, and therefore the reefs beneath it tend to be, more pinnacle-like, unlike the flatter terrain you might see in the Bahamas or the Florida Keys. So it is a very unique, wonderful island, both above and below. And as I said, there's a lot of geothermal activity. Boiling Lake, as you see, is the second largest hot spring known. Uh, Dominica is one of the youngest islands in the Antilles, which is one of the reasons it has this amazing geothermal activity. And there is even a dive site, Champagne Reef, where you see the gas bubbling from the sea surface, from the interior of the Earth. By the way, a side note, that's carbon dioxide, which means the water near it is going to be much higher acidic, or lower pH. And there are some interesting studies being done looking at what coral reefs might look like in the future with increasing acidifying oceans allowable in environments like this. So it could be an interesting test ground. And of course, it's so lush because the amount of rain it gets is ridiculous, 175 inches per year. And you kind of see in the US it's 38 on average, and there in Omaha it's about 31. So lots and lots of rain, particularly on the windward side, which is getting the initial cloud as it come into. So it is lush, and they have long been committed to conservation. They have several national parks, both above and below the water. And certainly, in addition to your diving activities, you want to spend some time in some of the terrestrial sites as well. It's also a major destination for cetacean tourism, whales and dolphins. You see listed there on the left the species of whales that you can see. There is a whale watching. Getting in the water is a little bit different, requires special permits. You cannot just go do that. But you can certainly go whale watching in the species of dolphins that frequent the water. So that's also another important and fascinating first activity there as well. And so that's pretty much it from my point of view. If you do have questions, you can unmute or put them in the chat for Sabrina to give to me. And just a reminder, our next ocean update will be the 19th of next month. And what we're going to talk about sharks, but we're not really going to talk about the sharks themselves. But I want to talk about their role and benefit to humans, and concomitantly what we have done to them. Because I think it's a topic that's not really addressed too well. We really have given sharks a bad time, unfortunately, and we can lose out a lot by continuing to do things to them as we are. So with that said, I'm going to kind of turn things back over to Sabrina and field any questions you might have. Thank you again. Sabrina?
All right, thank you, Alex. Okay, we do have a question from David Hollis. He's wondering, have we seen a material increase in diving accidents due to lionfish hunting? Death, lost diver, marine life injuries?
That's a good question, and that had not been posed before. Dan would be the source. Dan, of course, does an annual review of their accidents. And I don't know if they collect data on lionfish, so that would be the first question. I don't know of any studies ongoing looking specifically at the injuries, but I gotta suspect there's probably some wilderness medical folks that are interested, people working in envenomation, things of that nature. But there's certainly nothing either in the popular literature in diving or anyone that I know of that's looking at that. And typically it's it's a painful but relatively minor issue. It often almost overwhelmingly goes unreported. I only have one instance where I was on a boat and a student actually stuck his hand in a zookeeper and got stuck by 3 different spines, and he actually had to be hospitalized overnight, mainly because of the reaction. And he was not in any peril, but the docs just wanted to keep an eye on him overnight. But it is a good point I had not really considered before.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we have another question. Is there more potential to fish for lionfish?
More potential in terms of opportunities. There's ample opportunities, and like I said, if you can develop a relationship with a restaurant and you can supply them on a dependable basis, you're going to have a customer. And so these are great fish to eat, and restaurants throughout Florida, the Caribbean that can get them are will put them on their menu in a heartbeat. What will happen if these commercial traps, if these experimental traps are approved? I think you will see a more robust fishery. Even currently, the lobster fishers in the Keys, uh, for a while, we're getting more per pound for lionfish coming out of the traps than for lobsters. But those markets, of course, vary. So I think indeed there will be a very significant commercial fishery if the appropriate device can be developed.
Okay, we have another question here. Would lionfish now be considered a keystone predator alongside sharks? Absent a natural apex predator, is human conservation the best hope for controlling the population?
You know, it's interesting where you would whether you would consider an invasive species keystone. If you define it as an organism that has uh, an overwhelming impact on the ecology of the ecosystem, yeah, I suppose you could call them keystone in that sense. But uh, the fact that they're not natural, I think you'd have a tough time, making that argument with an ecologist. Uh, Again, who knows what's going to happen in the future? We could, in future generations, these fish may adapt to being here and they become part. I mean, I use the example of wild pigs here in Florida, where they were brought here by the conquistadors in the 16th century, and they've been around, and they're part of the terrestrial ecology of Central Florida. Uh, so yeah, they're still invasive, but they're really been around for quite some time. So you're in a realm here that I think ecologists are really kind of wrestling with, and a lot of it's going to depend probably on how well we're able to control them, and if they, just how significant they will be. But clearly, in the studies from the Bahamas that I showed you, that 80% figure, you've got to consider an organism that can have that impact on an environment, a keystone predator, in my view.
Awesome. Okay, and then another question in the chat. You mentioned not training predators, quote unquote. Where does hunting lionfish, cutting off spines, and dumping back into the ocean fall? I've seen that happen where they weren't interested in keeping the lionfish for personal consumption.
I guess it would depend on where you were dumping them. If you were dumping them right at the reef, then you're encouraging exactly what we don't want to happen, and that's for habituation of moray eels, sharks, etc., expect, as you saw in those videos, a free meal. Uh, if you're in transit and you're in deep water, throwing it offshore, that's probably something altogether different. And as much as I hate to see it, I'd rather see them rotting in a field somewhere than than just creating the kinds of hazards that they have in some places with moray eels and sharks. But man, if you're going to go to that extent, fillet these things. The food is the meat is wonderful. Next.
Then we just have a comment that says dive charters often fillet fish and dump the unwanted into the marina.
Well, that's a big exactly, and that is a common occurrence with all, and it's a dumb thing to do for a couple of reasons. The decomposition, of course, is just going to contribute to anoxia, and so dumping scraps of fish into the water is not a good idea in confined areas like marinas. Period. You're unlikely, I think, to habituate a predator in that case, although I guess it would be possible if one happens to hang around there eventually. But discarding scraps, from fishing, it should be done appropriately, not tossed back into the water in confined areas, particularly in marinas and canals and places like that.
All right, and then we have two more questions here. I may have missed this, is there a temperature zone for lionfish? And then how fast does sargassum grow?
50 degrees Fahrenheit and seems to be the limit at which they can survive. Below 50 degrees, they can't. Their physiology is adapted for that. Good question on the growth rate. Brown algae, the fastest growing plants, quote unquote, although algae is not a plant, are the brown alga, and the giant kelp of California can grow, a meter a day. I don't know specifically about sargassum. That would be a good Wikipedia question, but it is as a brown alga, I would suspect it's pretty significant. And to expand to a width of 5,000 miles all the way across the North Atlantic, it's got to be pretty prodigious. But I will actually look that up. Growth rate of sargassum. Stump the stars today. Anything else?
Yes, we have another sargassum question.
Mhm.
Is this a cyclical problem coming to a peak? Is there an end in sight?
The easy answer is we don't know. We do know that for the time frame where it's been examined, which is from about 2010, it has continued to grow. It is cyclical in that the warmer temperatures, facilitate the growth. So it does tend to be very much a summertime problem. But here's the issue. Why are there so many nutrients being dumped in these rivers? And certainly the Mississippi River, given the where Diventures is concentrated, you know that a lot of that water comes out of farm fields. But the Amazon, the Orinoco, keep in mind that the Amazon's being clear cut for cattle production, basically. And a lot of that manure and nutrients, etc. There's far more getting into those two rivers than there used to be. And likewise in the Congo, with the deforestation happening there. And then as the Sahara Desert expands, as things get warmer, there's more dust put into the atmosphere, which is another issue. So we're kind of contributing all to putting more and more nutrients into the ocean in general, which is the biggest pollution problem we have globally. So will the problem go away? Only time will tell, but we certainly keeps jabbing a stick at it. I don't foresee that happening, at least in the near term.
All right, that is all the questions for now. If there are any other questions, you can email Alex at thebrylske@me.com, or you can email me, sabrina.severin@diventures.com, and I can pass the questions along to Dr. Brylske. Thank you everyone for tuning in to our third episode. And as he mentioned, the fourth one will be on April 19th. If this is the first one you tuned into, you can watch episodes 1 and 2 on our Diventures YouTube channel. You can also find them through our website, and also all the sources that Alex has used in his webinars, you can find on our website as well. And we really hope to see you for our next episode. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your day. And yes, email with any questions you might have. And hunt some lionfish, eat them up too.
Thank you, folks. Thanks for joining us.